Welcome to the London Luminaries, 16 heritage properties working together collaboratively to share our collective history. My name is Rachel Morrison and I'm the host for this evening's talk. So I get the pleasure and the delight of welcoming our incredible stand-in chair for this evening, a fellow trustee of the London Luminaries, a trustee of Pope's Grotto Preservation Trust, and a general good egg. It's Angela Kidner.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to all of you who are joining us live, and to those of you also who are watching us on the YouTube channel. Thank you for the kind introduction, Rachel. It is an honour to stand in as chair, although, as always, Judith is a hard act to follow. Thanks are owed to both you and Judith, Chris, Robert and Ricky, and all of those behind the scenes who've made this series possible. And also to you, our audience, who have, through your donations, supported the work of our historic locations. We have also reason to be grateful to the Lottery Fund, but it is the ongoing support of you and our visitors that keeps us afloat. And tonight there are 250 of you who've bought tickets, so you're in a good-sized audience. This lecture is the 5th in our current series, Conspiracy and Betrayl, or the 6th if you count our first in-person event at Pitshanger Manor, which was such a success that we hope to repeat it at next year in another of our partners' venues. The Luminaries series will be recorded, as Rachel has described, and these recordings will be fully captioned. So if you have difficulty hearing anything live, you can watch the recording in a few days to pick up on anything you may have missed. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker. Catherine Parry-Wingfield is an art historian with a long career in teaching and lecturing, specialising in the visual arts of 18th and early 19th century Britain and Europe. She was a trustee of Turner's House Trust from its inception in 2005 and its chair from 2013 to 2019, during which time she was actively engaged as a member of the conservation project team, particularly with the presentation of the interior. Her work has resulted in a gem of a restored historic house that is open 5 days a week with the programme of education and events, and which is a key founding partner in the London Luminaries. Over to you, Catherine.
Thank you very much, Angela, for that introduction. I just want to say the title of my talk, which is He Has Been Here and Fired a Gun. I hope that that's not going to make any of you feel nervous. No guns are going to be fired during this talk, and indeed none were fired by Turner at the time which we're going to be looking at. And just a practical thing, all the paintings we're going to see are by Turner unless otherwise captioned. Although here on my startups slide, we've got Constable here and Turner on the right. I should say Constable perhaps in the red corner and Turner in the blue corner, because it is in the end going to lead to a little bit of a fight. But just to begin a little earlier in the story, in 1805, when Turner is settled in Isleworth. Just to say a little bit about Turner's background, born in 1775, died in 1851, a teenage prodigy. He's 14 years old when he becomes a student at the Royal Academy and starts selling watercolours in his teens. He's a full academician by 1807 when he's 31, which was good going at that time. And unlike a lot of other artists, he had no social advantages. His father was a Covent Garden barber, but earlier artists like Hogarth and Reynolds had schoolmaster fathers, which gave them a good bit of learning, particularly in the classics, which was extremely important for subject matter for painting at the time, and a kind of shared cultural experience among those of, how to say, the upper classes. Not for us now, I don't think, though having just discovered the wonderful Chaos, K-A-O-S, on Netflix, if you want to be up on your classics with a modern twist, I do recommend it. Turner really picked up his knowledge of the classics as he went along, reading in translation, particularly in this particular instance. This is Virgil, writing in the 1st century AD about a story lost in the mists of time. And Turner is reading that in Dryden's translation. It's a quiet time for him. He's gone off to Isleworth to study the river, to escape the tensions, the rivalry, and the backstabbing at the Royal Academy. They were very good at all that. I would have no idea whether they still are, but who knows? In one of his sketchbooks, tucked away among many drawings and conceptual sketches, is this lovely little watercolour. This is a first idea on a theme of love and betrayal that will remain with him for the rest of his life. Virgil's great classic tells the story of the Trojan prince Aeneas, who is fleeing defeat by the Greeks. He's shipwrecked at Carthage due to some nasty work on the parts of the gods of Olympus, who are quite good at nasty tricks. Aeneas will join Dido, the queen of Carthage, the widowed queen. And here in this little watercolour, he is arriving for the royal hunt. According to the Dryden's translation, the queen, Aeneas, and the Tyrian court shall to the shady woods for sylvan games resort. Well, Aeneas had a destiny, and his destiny was to found Rome. The shipwreck and the charms of Dido divert him from this quest. Dido had sworn to remain faithful to the memory of her murdered husband. It's not going to end well. We'll return to Turner's fascination with this subject by the end of the talk. But let's just move then from the ancients and that particular moment of quiet at Isleworth to the moderns, if you like, the late 18th and early 19th centuries, which were a great time for satirists. None greater than Rowlandson, and here Gilray. Gilray loving to pick up on the foibles of human nature. His Titianus Redivivus, or Titian Reborn, picks up here on a scandal in the art world, and Gilray is utterly gleeful. He's loading this print with all the pomposity of Latin texts. A young woman called Anne Provis claims to have somehow found a copy of the great 16th century Venetian painter Titian's recipe for colour. And this was at a time when the tastemakers and the painters who wanted to please them were often seeking, if you like, to channel the old masters rather than break new boundaries. And Anne Provis found a very willing and, in fact, very gullible audience for this hoax, because that's what it was, until she got busted and somehow managed to fade away completely unpunished. Here are the 7 wise men, all academicians who've fallen for the hoax and handed over 10 guineas each for the Venetian secret, with even the president, Benjamin West, creeping away, holding onto his palette. Even he has handed over that money. Ruthless labelling, I think, is a little bit like a day of judgment. Here is Anne Provis in a tatty dress, but with a splendid overgown, a kind of peacock train held up by the 3 graces. And she is embellishing with her colours this perfectly awful caricature of Titian's late self-portrait. We've got a number of little putti blowing trumpets here, and a little gang down here who are also blowing trumpets, though in a rather different way. The central one, I'm afraid you can't see it, it's all gone to pieces, but he's actually labelled Beaumont. We're coming to him in a second. And notice the gleeful crowd here longing to, as it were, join in the fall of the mighty and the exposure of their having been completely taken in by a hoaxer. So, picking up again on 1805, when Turner was in Isleworth, that's also the year when the Royal Institution was set up in premises on Pall Mall, principally by Sir George Beaumont, but usually known as an utterly respectable man of the highest distinction. He was a baronet, he was wealthy, he was titled, he was an MP, he was a collector, he was a patron, and he was also an adequate landscape painter, as you see here from this example of his work on the right. Hopner, by the way, who painted his portrait, was one of the 7 wise men who'd been taken in by Anne Provis. His painting here of Jaques and the Wounded Stag, this is a Shakespearean theme from As You Like It. And you can see it's a little bit murky in the way that Sir George Beaumont paints. The British institution had a governing body of aristocrats who were all very like-minded in their conservative views on what constituted good art. And they were more than a little patronising very often to emerging British painters. A lot of the academicians disliked the whole setup, including Turner, even though they would exhibit their work at the Royal Institution when there was the opportunity. George Beaumont was a persistent and destructive critic of JMW Turner. Big question, why should such a privileged member of the establishment so hate Turner's work? And unfortunately for Turner, Beaumont was able to rally around a number of equally conservative-minded people, including some artists, John Constable among them, just 1 year younger than Turner and a protege of George Beaumont. But Constable took a great deal longer to achieve recognition in the art world. He didn't become a full academician until the age of 55. For a moment, let's consider some of Beaumont's comments. They're not very nice. Turner's done more harm in misleading taste than any other artist. And in 1806, he said, Turner's paintings appear like the works of an old man. Turner was 30, who had ideas but has lost his powers of execution. And referring to some of his work as blots. He visited one of Turner's exhibitions in Turner's own gallery. It seems just to reinforce his own prejudices, and came away as usual with a sneer, saying again that he had seen no power of execution. Maybe it's because he was so privileged socially and so conservative in his artistic taste. He maybe resented Turner as some kind of Cockney upstart. In his own work, as we've seen, he was utterly traditional, absolutely revering the great 17th century painter Claude, as of course, so did Turner, who stipulated in his will that 2 of his works should hang next to 2 paintings by Claude in the National Gallery, which both Turner and Sir George Beaumont supported when it was being set up. But Turner is much broader in his approaches. He's also a daring innovator, constantly challenging himself, constantly introducing new techniques, newly introduced colours. And rather than seeking to reproduce, as it were, old masters, complete with muddy brown foliage, he really observed nature in all its changes and was always, always seeking for new inspiration. So all this conservative attitude, after all, what was the summer exhibition at the Royal Academy all about, except to showcase contemporary work and offer a marketplace, an extremely important thing. So the academicians often grumbled a lot. In 1815, after the usual winter display of old masters at the British Institution, the tables were turned, and there was a blistering and an anonymous attack in the Morning Chronicle, very important organ of information at that time. And this attacked the perceived ignorance of that privileged elite who were forcing their own taste on the public. In their words, mischievously, these people had a mischievously superficial acquaintance with old paintings. If a new production fails to remind them of something they've seen before, it's instantly condemned. So who wrote it? Well, that still remains a mystery, but Turner went to that exhibition along with his patron and his great friend, Walter Fawkes. And the two of them are quite probably still the prime suspects. So let's see how Turner, as it were, rallied to all this. Beaumont had a huge dislike of what he called white paintings. In particular, Turner's experimentation with a white ground, which gives a huge lift to paintings like this, the Dort, the packet boat from Rotterdam, Becalmed, shown in 1818 at the Royal Academy's summer exhibition. Turner had visited the Netherlands in 1817, just 2 years after the long wars against France had ended, and he produced this wonderfully serene painting the next year, where it was given the most prominent position in the great room at Somerset House. It's not a grand history painting. It's not a tragic event from a long distant past. It's an everyday scene from modern life in a country that spent a lot of its time on water. The crowded packet boat on the River Meuse is becalmed. It can't get into port. There are small boats coming and going, taking people off, taking perhaps cargo off and putting more things on. Crew members are leaning over the side, lifting up packages. And Dordrecht itself is on the skyline here. The overall mood is one of a sunny serenity and that extraordinary luminosity that marks a great change in Turner's style. But Beaumont didn't care for it. For him, it was just a white painting, or quite possibly also a blot. Some of the formal critics were hugely impressed. It's worth saying. When reviewing the RA Summer Exhibition in 1818, the Morning Chronicle declared it to be one of the most magnificent pictures, an honour to our age. And for all that apparent serenity to a modern viewer, it was actually quite a revolutionary piece of art, not just the white ground that gives it that bright atmosphere and luminosity in the sky, those wonderful reflections of sun on water, but also he's experimenting with new pigments, a chrome yellow that was introduced a few years before, a very bright colour that Turner uses with this magically light touch. It's a busy scene. I think if you could turn up the sound, you would hear a lot of chatter, a lot of shouting of directions. You would hear perhaps some ripples of the water. You might hear some of the sounds of these boats disappearing into the reeds, perhaps the sounds of the water birds. Even John Constable, Turner's rival, was impressed and said, probably rather quietly, it was one of the most magnificent paintings I've ever seen. But Beaumont was not impressed. And of course, it's unlike his own rather dark paintings as possible. Another visitor was shocked at the unaccustomed brightness. It almost puts your eyes out. However, the effects of light, of sun, look at it wonderfully shining through the sails. All this is something that Turner will constantly study, experiment, and develop throughout his life. This painting was bought by that friend and patron, Walter Fawkes, and it was then displayed. You get some idea of its size here in the drawing room of Walter Fawkes' great house up at Farnley near Leeds, where it will be joined by many other paintings by Turner. And this is Turner, if you like, painting his own work here in pride of place in the drawing room. Just to sign off from Beaumont, we've given him rather a bad time, I think. He wasn't really all bad. He was a man of his time. As a patron, he gave Michelangelo's exquisite Tondo of the Virgin and Child to the Royal Academy, where it's still displayed, and hugely encouraged the setting up of the National Gallery, to which he donated major works by Claude and by other great painters of the past, as of course did Turner, who donated his own work. So let's move to the great rivalry here. Turner on the left and Constable on the right, both self-portraits and of very similar dates. And they are, as I've said, of a very similar age. Turner, the youthful prodigy, attracting greater attention really from extreme youth, from his teens, and Constable somewhat in his shadows. Though Constable had inherited money, he'd inherited social graces, as it were, or acquired social graces, and presented himself much more attractively than Turner did to the establishment. Constable had quite a lot to say about Turner, at one point calling him stark mad, and writing to his fiancée, uncouth as I expected, but a wonderful range of mind. It's rather grudging praise, isn't it? Turner, more introverted, didn't really much go in for saying rude things about other people, maybe aware of his social inferiority, and also, I have to say, I'm sure, aware of his own genius. If we move into middle age and to the all-important marketplace, the Academy's summer exhibitions, by this time Turner had become very well known, both for his great commercial success and also for his increasingly scruffy appearance, whereas Constable remained well turned out and socially graceful. Here is a print after Rowlandson showing the exhibition room at Somerset House, where the Royal Academy was then housed, that wonderful room, top lit on all sides, where the summer exhibition was held in that day. The pride of place was always on this end wall. Rowlandson wonderfully picks up on all the clusters of people, some of whom, of course, are not remotely interested in the paintings, but very interested in one another. Others peering closely, like this chap here, and so on. The Dort in 1818 had been hung in pride of place, the summer exhibition. And just a slight digression, of course, the exhibition room was approached by what still remains an extremely steep and scary staircase. This building is now the Courtauld, as I'm sure many of you will know. And Rowlandson is showing us the great throng making its way up to the summer exhibition. And this rather stout lady has tripped over someone's little dog, causing a kind of domino effect here, and all the rather voyeuristic men on the side taking a really good look at an unusual opportunity, you might say. I love the Rowlandson statue in this niche, totally naked, just giving a little backward glance over her shoulder. Oh dear, there they go again. There's always great rivalry for the best position in the great room, on the end wall, above the line, on the line, above head height, but not skied, not way up at the very top, or indeed put in a side room. And those positions were determined by the Academy's hanging committee. Needless to say, as I said, you know, people who did not please the hanging committee often got the worst positions. So we move to 1832, where both Turner and Constable have secured good positions for their major entries. And this is where we started. Here is Constable with his opening of Waterloo Bridge from Whitehall Stairs, June the 18th, 1817. That is all part of the title. Constable had made sketches, preliminary studies, and so on for this painting for so long that by the time it was exhibited 15 years later, the Prince Regent, somehow hidden down here on this little temporary quay, was no longer Prince Regent. He'd become king. In fact, he had died and been succeeded by William IV. So this effectively has almost become a history painting. Here is the Waterloo Bridge, so named, of course, for the great victory of 1815. ending those long wars against France. It's also our wedding anniversary, but there you go. So June the 18th, 1815, but not finished by Constable, who returns to this big canvas many times, who works on it, who adds lots of touches of thick paint, thick impasto, and a great deal of red, of vermilion paint. It's a very busy painting, not very well received by the critics or the general audience. They found it too fussy, too crowded. And Turner's main exhibit for that year was almost the exact opposite. It was much smaller, much more restrained. Helvoetsluis, the city of Utrecht, 64, going to sea, painted in 1817. Just to explain the subject matter, Helvoetsluis is near Rotterdam. It was a great naval base during the 17th century, which was a time of the Anglo-Dutch Wars, and this was the base of the Dutch fleet. So wars between the Dutch and the English. Later on, this central ship, the city of Utrecht 64, the 64 refers to the number of cannon, was the ship that escorted William of Orange to England and to the English throne. The hanging committee had done their work and the layout had been determined. The next bit of action comes as the artists come in to put finishing touches to their works. According to a story well remembered by the artists who were there on the day, Turner came in, looked hard at Constable's work, slowly reached for his brush and palette, and added a large daub of red lead paint, perhaps more brilliant than it now is, and a much more vibrant and intense red than Constable's vermilion. Constable returned and made this comment: "He has been here and fired a gun." The impact seemed to have hit him like a shot, and that long-standing rivalry, very much vocal on Constable's part and also rather snide in terms of Turner the man, at this point becomes rather public warfare. Both paintings relate to historic battles. Waterloo is now historic, it's 15 years in the past, and 17th century Holland. Perhaps Constable was thinking of cannon fire, or perhaps just a pot shot from a pistol. Turner had a couple of those. I don't think he took them into the Royal Academy, however. So let's see those two paintings together, as we did at the beginning. And I've tried to make the size difference become a little bit more apparent. The next thing was varnishing day, when Turner appeared again, worked a little more on the red daub, shaped it into a boy, varnished it, and all was done. It's a striking device, just lifting this almost monochromatic, this silvery and restrained sea piece by that touch of red. Morally, it unsettled Turner's rival, as Turner undoubtedly intended. Just to get a bit behind this slightly dubious trick on Turner's part, we need to go back a year to the summer exhibition of 1831, when Constable, so long in Turner's shadow, had at last become a full academician, and particularly he had become a member of that year of the all-important hanging committee, those who got to decide who got which place in the great room of the academy. Until this time, Constable and his interpretations of the English landscape, often large-scale pastorals, scenes very familiar to the viewers, but painted with a new freshness, had really been underrated. But by 1831, he's definitely coming into his own. And I think at last, Turner, who'd often just ignored him, was perceiving him as a serious rival. In 1831, it had been decided that Turner's painting Caligula's Palace should have pride of place on that end wall in the Great Room, with Constable's Salisbury Cathedral to one side of it, and Turner's Medea, Vision of Medea, on the other side. But at the last minute, Constable, exercising his powers on the hanging committee, swapped Turner's Caligula's Palace for Salisbury Cathedral, his own painting, one of his 6-footers, so a large, dark and dramatic landscape, and put that in the center of those three. The rainbow may well have been added later, but this great stormy scene, Salisbury Cathedral with its soaring spire, is Constable perhaps being symbolic here? Do those storm clouds represent perhaps a little threat about the future of the Anglican Church? Who knows? Certainly Turner had been, Constable had been encouraged to paint it by his friends, the Bishop Fisher and his nephew, the Archdeacon at Salisbury. Dramatic as it was, it failed to find a buyer. The critics didn't really help. They found it exaggerated and unnatural. Turner was absolutely furious at having this large dramatic work substituted in pride of place for his own Caligula's Palace, and he tackled Constable head on. This would be a first, I think, for Turner, in front of their fellow painters at a dinner, the dinner that took place just before the exhibition would open to the public. The painter David Roberts wrote to a friend that Turner opened on Constable like a ferret. It was evident to all present that Turner detested him. Constable wriggled and twisted and said it was done to put Turner's work in the best light, to which Turner replied, "Well, why put your own there then?" But the hang remained in place. Constable had referred to Turner as he who would be lord of all. Here, Constable got the upper hand, though not without receiving a few battle scars. But the next year, as we've seen, Turner fired his gun and took his revenge without a word being exchanged between them. And in that 1831 exhibition, those two large works that flanked Salisbury Cathedral, not to Turner's liking. This is Caligula's Palace of 1831. This drew a lot of praise. Now Turner, in his maturity, experimenting with misty sunrise against a ruin of the ancient world, something to reflect on the fall of great ambition, of great greed, if you like, and a place of perhaps of seeing as it's Caligula, great horrors. These historic subjects would have been extremely interesting, I think, to the exhibition goers of the time. One reviewer had great praise for this, writing, "It is poetry itself. The air tint, the distances are magical for brilliancy and depth, and richness and power. It can hardly be surpassed." So not all critics were bad. They loved that rather airy handling of paint. They wondered, I think, as we do still, how did Turner actually do it? And of course, this fall of ancient empires is a recurring theme for Turner and for others. As for the Vision of Medea, this was not very well received either by the public or by the critics. Turner had painted it the year before, in 1827, when he was in Rome, and he's exhibited in Rome, where it was rather well received. But in England, they didn't take this on board. They simply thought that was because the Roman viewers were a large and vulgar crowd. It was not really understood, and the criticisms were really rude. An extravagant daub, or how about this one? Turn it on its side or upside down, it's all the same. Maybe the worst of all, a strong fit of yellow insanity, an agony of ochre, a gamboge frenzy worthy of Bedlam. Well, the subject matter is pretty dark. Medea, whom Turner describes in the little listing that he attached to it as Medea in full tide of her witchery. Medea has been abandoned by Jason. She has brewed up various poisons and she's going to murder their children. And Turner shows her again in the sky, chucking their bodies out of her dragon-drawn chariot. Well, that one didn't hit it with the public, I'm afraid, or probably not for us either. The satirist getting quite vicious as time goes by. All that glow of enthusiasm for Turner in his youth tends to give way to some pretty rude things. Here is Richard Doyle for his monthly almanac, Turner painting one of his pictures. Well, it may be in red, but of course the bucket of paint is actually yellow, as you can see. So gamboge is a yellow, as we've just heard one criticism. And Turner's short stature is made all the more exaggerated by the enormous size of his top hat. And that mistiness which some critics admired is being caricatured by Turner approaching his canvas with a large mop dipped in his bucket of yellow paint. Well, drawing towards the end of Turner's life and almost the end of this talk, I just want to show one of his last exhibited works, where again we have that dissolving into a kind of ethereal mistiness. Turner died the year after this was exhibited. Mercury sent to admonish Aeneas. So here we are back in that great love story, that doomed love story of Dido and Aeneas, which Turner had started to play with 30 years before. That theme of love and betrayal. Aeneas, who is here, now armored and helmeted, has agreed to the demands of the gods. He will abandon Dido and he will embark and he will sail to his destiny to found Rome. Dido, consumed with guilt that she had betrayed her oath to remain faithful to the memory of her murdered husband, summons a funeral pyre, stabs herself, curses Aeneas, and swears that his tribe, the Trojans, and Carthage will forever be enemies, and then immolates herself. Here it is that moment. Aeneas stands receiving Mercury's message, and beside him, confusingly, is Cupid. If you want to know more, you're going to have to do a bit of reading. Aeneas and Cupid share a mother, and that is Venus. However, we don't have time to go into that now. Mercury, the messenger of the gods, in Virgil's words, in translation at least, melts into the air against the rising sun. And that is Mercury, if you like, melting into the air. Of course, the critics had fun, a little tempered by respect for the painter's great age. On being advised to stand back to understand the painting's form, one critic said, "How far back? Till it's out of sight?" But others praised the magic of those ethereal brushstrokes. Turner, trying to the last of his abilities to paint what surely in his younger days would have been thought impossible. So the great magician conjuring up the ancient world, the sun glowing through mist, that melting of atmosphere, all a million miles away from what those critics, those taste setters of his youth would have regarded as a good painting. Just to end or come towards a conclusion, just to round up a few personal insults for you. Constable's uncouth. And during a row at one of the RA's committee meetings, Turner was called a little reptile. Rather daringly, he rounded on his accuser and said, "You are a great reptile, sir, with ill manners." He was also called short, stout, and bandy-legged. Do I need to go on? Those are the personal insults. And then again, against his paintings, soapsuds, whitewash, blots, a lady getting out of a mustard pot, streaked with blue and green, blue and pink, better get the colour right, and thrown in a flower pot. Well, Turner rarely responded to those barbs, and when asked how he felt about the flower pot one, he said, "I never move in these matters." Very dignified, and nor did he involve himself in too much of this self-destructive infighting in the academy, other than that very public battle in paint with Constable. I believe he knew his own worth, and perhaps as the years went by, cared less and less what people had to say about him. But just to finish with a late work, The Angel Standing in the Sun, exhibited in 1846 and often misinterpreted as a beautiful, misty vision of St. Michael. This is a work where Turner's perhaps long suppressed bitterness against the volley of criticism he'd received is finally finding a way into paint. The angel holds a flaming sword and presides over Old Testament scenes of murder, betrayal, and conspiracy. Adam and Eve are discovering the body of their son, Abel, murdered by his brother Cain, according to Genesis, the first murder. Delilah betrays her lover Samson, who will now be led to his death, and beautiful Judith seduces Holofernes before beheading him. How's that for betrayal? Turner attached quotations to many of his paintings, and this one has two. One from Samuel Rogers' Voyage of Columbus, the feast of vultures when the day is done. You can see the vultures in the sky. The vultures, I think, were Turner's critics and widely thought to be perhaps not vultures, but eagles. The Reverend John the Eagles, who was another relentless critic and a reviewer for Blackwood's magazine. And there's another quote from Revelation, the Revelation of St. John, from which Turner's title is taken. "I saw an angel standing in the sun. Gather yourselves unto the supper of the great God, that ye may eat the flesh of kings." So a pessimistic and disturbing image, and quite possibly one which is deeply revealing of Turner's well-concealed vulnerability. So we can end with a verbal bouquet from one critic, the genius of our age. That is a better note to end on. But I do want to say that unbelievably, this image is produced or reproduced, I should say, as wallpaper. I should say, please don't buy it, because you know what's really there now. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Catherine. Is there a final slide?
There is. Yes, let's move to it. Indeed.
Lovely. I love that final slide. I can't wait for the question and answer. Sorry. Here goes my video. Here we go. But first, I should just give you a quick plug for the next talk, which will be given by Sarah McGrady of Ham House. This will be a very interesting one, A Woman's Place, How the Royalist Women of Ham House Defended Their Own. This is on the 3rd of October at 7 o'clock. And followed by our final talk in the series, which will be on the 7th of November, given by our trustee, Ricky Pound, director of the Twickenham Museum. Tickets for both are on our website, so please do go to that and book.